Ja, meine Damen und Herren, herzlich willkommen.
Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to the InnoTrans Preview, the International Bus Forum, the title of which is the Future Electric? Strategies for E-Buses in the Context of Climate Action and Imposed Austerity. Now today we should be about 8 kilometers away from here to the west of where we are now at InnoTrans, the large industry exhibition which is held every 2 years in Berlin. Now, it's not going to work out this year, but it's a great pleasure to welcome you here in Berlin at the representative offices of Commerzbank right by the Brandenburg Gate, so right out of the capital city of Germany. It's one of the many fora that we organize in the virtual sphere at the moment, but it actually shows you that even this corona pandemic will not stop us. We'll find new ways to drive the exchange forward and present new ideas. And I think it's precisely in situations like these where that is important. Secretary of State Tamara Zieschang, ladies and gentlemen, on behalf of my colleagues on the board of the Deutsche Verkehrsforum, I'd like to welcome you to our discussion on strategies of e-buses. The COVID-19 crisis, of course, has left severe marks on all transportation undertakings. We are losing income and we're currently working hard to restore the trust of our customers in public transport. And we're doing a good job in that respect. Our income losses mean that this is certainly not from over, and we're really happy that the federal government has presented the first aid package to cushion some of the effects. Now, when Corona broke in March, we were wondering what would that mean for our investment activities? Will we preserve our financing programs, especially when we convert our fleet to electric buses? So can we maintain that, or will we have to pedal back? Will there be possibly a scrappage bonus for diesel vehicles, which comes at the expense of electric buses? Now, we've all seen that both the German government, the European administrations, and also the towns and cities have spoken up for climate action. That's a very important sign, a very important signal in the situation we currently are in. There's a clear commitment by policymakers on different levels to conversion of conventional vehicles fleets to e-mobility, and we need exactly that. So rather than spurring the economy with scrappage bonuses, I think we are much better advised to use public transport companies like ours to spur the economy. Whenever we place an order, it's manufacturers, it's construction businesses that are happy. And with that, we can also attain our climate action targets, because public transport will and indeed wants to make a contribution to climate action, and that's a contribution that will only increase in relevance and size in the years to come. And then we also have pooling effects vis-à-vis private vehicle traffic, but the big lever clearly here is the conversion of our vehicle fleet to carbon-neutral drivetrain solutions. We in Berlin at BVG, together with our partners in the Senate administration and the federal government, have defined a target of converting our bus fleet to emissions-free drivetrain solutions by 2030. And despite the corona pandemic, we maintain this objective. It's part of our transportation contract that we are currently negotiating with the authorities as we speak. And something that's also abundantly clear is that this will not be possible without additional investment activities, so there will be special charges for transport undertakings, of course. And when we look at the situation, we need to see the status quo, and we know that more research is being done, and we talk about that in a moment. But today, as we speak, there will be additional charges and costs for operators. We're only seeing the ramp-up of electric vehicles, so e-buses are still significantly more expensive than diesel buses at the moment. So if we take a decision now to convert, we need to see that the extra costs are being compensated for. But there's more than that. It's not only buses. There's an entire infrastructure, a whole string of events that comes after that. Charging infrastructure, parking and storage capabilities. We need more space for depots. We need more staff, obviously, because those buses don't have the driving range like a conventional diesel bus. So all of these things need to be thrown into the balance. But I think we're in a good way forward. There's a clear political commitment, number one. And number two, we work in close collaboration with industry to talk about things like range extension and the optimized use of vehicle fleet. This is a major opportunity, of course, a challenge as well, but these opportunities and challenges we can muster together with industry, with other collaboration partners, and indeed also political decision makers. Now, be it as it may, we need more people, and that will also mean more costs that are related to those additional staff and levels. What does that mean? Well, going forward, we need a triad of electromobility that will drive us forward. And that means getting ready now, starting now, and have the financial means that it takes to support that. I'd like to lodge a clarion call with policymakers here as well. Use public transport as an investment platform. You know, we don't want a scrappage bonus like you have in the car industry. It would be just as good to purchase low-emission and environmentally friendly electric buses. Planning reliability is important for transport undertakings, but also for industry players in order to drive this development forward. There's a program on clean air, there's an environmental protection program, and also a stimulus package which includes those funds. So we work in close cooperation with OEMs. We're pushing ahead when it comes to extending driving range and battery capacities. And when we do that for buses and coaches, that will have an impact for passenger vehicle fleets as well. So what we're doing now will be sustainable if we're joining forces with the OEMs. We need research, we need a targeted investment policy, and sometimes just be bold and get started, rather than going on and discussing different studies and analyze, but rather say, okay, why don't we try something out now? And you have to be bold to do that, because everything doesn't work. There will be occasional setbacks here and there. People will be stumbling on that road, but I think that's part of the whole story. If you are single-minded and focused on this way forward, for which we're certainly happy to display courage and say, well, maybe we, walk off the beaten track just to identify the right objectives for climate action that we all need. Now, R&D is also important. As I said before, we need to look at auxiliary equipment on board. How do we use energy storage facilities, the second use and recycling of batteries? In-service charging is also something that we need to look at. Not only for us is this relevant, but also it's high on the agenda for the OEMs in the industry. The local conditions, it's the third point I'd like to mention, these have to be right as well. It's not at all just buying a few buses that you put into your depot and tell the driver, well, you drove a diesel bus yesterday, tomorrow you'll be in an electric one. There's much more than that. There's charging infrastructure, it's training of staff, and for that, obviously, larger space requirement. Now that again plays the ball back to the municipal authorities. There's a scarcity of land, of spaces, and especially in a large and great city like Berlin, we're always competing with investors, with residential construction, with other commercial estate users. So we're certainly happy to engage in talks, and we're happy also to explore compromise. But we need room, we need space for charging infrastructure that need not necessarily used by us ourselves. Maybe additional users may tap into that while we don't have our buses parked in the depot. But as I said, we need spaces, we need quick planning approval procedures to make sure that we achieve our zero emission targets as soon as we can. And this brings me full circle back to courage and unusual ideas. This is also what we need for planning approval and space availability. It's not just good to say, look, we have our buses here, but if we don't have any place to put them and to charge them, then it's going to be all futile. But, ladies and gentlemen, I'm confident that we've started really well with our e-mobility projects. When I talk to other colleagues from other transport operators, we can be pretty proud of ourselves. It has been a good start, but we shouldn't stop here. We need to stay on the gas pedal, as it were. We need to push ahead also in collaboration with the OEMs, with the manufacturers, because they need to work with us together. Plus, we need political support, because our long-term effective or efficiency target will be emissions-free vehicle fleets by 2030, which is clearly something that we've put on our agenda. Thank you very much for your participation, and now I'd like to give it over for the introductory works to Tamara Zishank from the Federal Ministry of Transport and Digital Infrastructure. We're looking forward to your input. Ladies and gentlemen, Mr. Erfurt, we have just said it. When we talk about public transport, rail and bus, we know that you are making a very important contribution here to achieve our climate action targets that we've set for ourselves. I mean, just a number that you all are possibly aware of is that every day 30 million people use buses and trains in this country, showing that it's an appealing way for people to travel, but it also means that public transport is making a tangible contribution to climate action, and we want to make sure that this doesn't change. People should use buses and rail. And you said earlier that we have a hybrid event here today. And by the way, what I just told you, those 30 million people in public transport are just the old figures of the old times, as it were. And today, as we talk about life in the times of the pandemic, the corona crisis, it is very and crucially important that people remain confident to use public transport. And I'm really happy that as this pandemic broke in March and April, that we found a shared solution together with the transport operators, with the municipal associations, to impose an obligation to wear face masks on public transport, and that all states of this country maintain a stringent obligation to do that, and that also creates for people the understanding that even if you cannot maintain a minimum distance, you have to wear a face mask to make sure that people are secure. But there's one thing, that's the commitment, as I said before, but the other thing is to actually put that into practice and to monitor that. Just yesterday we had a roundtable meeting not only with the federal governments and the municipal associations, but also the Association of the German Transport Undertakings, trade unions, and all of us together have sent a clear message to passengers, to most passengers who are wearing a face mask, because from what we understand, 90% of passengers are wearing a face mask day in, day out, and we're very grateful for that. But we also appealing to the remaining 10% to do the same. And then we've agreed on a set of measures that all of us can do in our jobs, both in ministries, in associations, and also in the transport undertakings. And we've identified a number of spot checks that will be conducted regularly. That's an important signal. We all should be interested to continuously use buses and trains also in times of the pandemic. I'm really glad that the coronavirus is not overshadowing just everything, but we're also dealing with other very important issues that are relevant for the future, like you are doing here today by putting climate action on the agenda again. It's not admissible, it's not conceivable for us to lose sight of what matters for society at large. And let me give you another number to illustrate why the bus and coach sector can make an important contribution towards climate action. The Federal Motor Authority says we have 80,000 registered buses and coaches in Germany, out of which 55,000 buses are operating in public transport. And this really tangibly shows you, looking at those large numbers, that buses and coaches can make a very important contribution as far as emissions are concerned, and therefore bus and coaches and their fleets must be modernized, must be converted, especially when it comes to alternative drivetrain solutions. And let me slightly critically challenge the title of this panel discussion here today, because it's called "Is the Future Electric Strategies for E-Buses in the Context of Climate Action and Imposed Austerity?" Now, my first question would be, why do you just refer to electric buses? Our ministry, doesn't have a technological bias. If it's true that e-mobility is one option, a very important option that we support, but I think we should not have any preference for certain technologies, because everyone should be able to use a technical solution that for them makes most sense and is most efficient to use, because this is really a decision that often transport operators will take. And there will be differences between the urban and the rural areas. I mean, an electric and charging infrastructure is easier to organize in a city than it is in rural areas where you might want to focus on hydrogen, for instance, more. I think we would all be well advised to refrain from a technological bias and keep our options open. And it's good that the municipal authorities decide what their local answers are and which of these are appropriate. You said it for Berlin, Mr. Erfurt, and I was just in Hamburg the other day and realized that there is a very powerful and influential set of committed decisions, and I always advocate for an open mix of different technological solutions, drivetrain solutions. We should keep that open mind also in terms of the transport undertakings, because they are the ones that take the final decisions, also with the economic considerations in mind, of course. And then there's also made mention of imposed austerity in the headline of the event here. Well, I think in those past years we have been lucky to have abundant tax revenues in administration, in local and federal administrations in this country. But you're certainly right when you're suggesting we need to look forward. So where you've started to convert your vehicle fleets with new concepts now, and especially now when the financial means are becoming scarcer, then this is certainly not acceptable to stop this funding. So in that sense I would agree, and there has been a decision also by the federal government to have 1 billion euros earmarked in the stimulus package for fleet renewal. That's an intentional signal, quite rightly so, because we realize that municipal budgets may be under pressure now in the corona pandemic, and therefore we make federal money available to support alternative drivetrain solutions without a preference for certain technologies, and also, infrastructure support is part of that equation as well. And let me quite confidently say that what these federal programs offer here is really going down well in the marketplace. Mr. Erfurt, you've mentioned some of these different funding schemes we have. There's one on e-mobility, there's one on clean air programs. Just these two programs, almost 400 battery electric buses have been able to be purchased out of those projects, that is. And as we speak now, in August 2020, only 466 battery electric buses exist in Germany. So the lion's share of them have been purchased through those federal funding programs, and this shows us that they are really needed in the marketplace. So with these two programs, the focus was not only in supporting bus technology, supporting investments in buses and coaches, but we want to make sure that municipal authorities also find an ideal targeted concept for their own operations. So where does charging infrastructure make sense? Where should it be? How can you develop a concept that makes sense in terms of a bus route network development? So the general changeover scenarios are also supported with the e-mobility initiative by the federal government. I'm really happy that already now, as we see, many local transport operators have been using those funds. And there's a third program that I'd like to briefly mention, which is looking at fuel cell technologies. 81 buses with a fuel cell technology on board has been purchased through that program, and that once again shows you that our ministry is open for different technologies. And all of that shows you that the federal government in the past years has powerfully supported local administrations so they can can modernize, renew and convert their vehicle fleets. And then from 2021 an additional 1 billion euros will be available, as I said before. And we want to avoid a situation that since financial budgets are shrinking now in the public budgets, we want to keep single-mindedly focused on our climate action targets. They need not change. And therefore our ministry, I think, can say that we are there to help you. Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Dr. Zishang. Ladies and gentlemen, I'd like to welcome you as well on my own behalf. After these two introductory speeches, I would like to introduce the panel discussion to you, and in the next 60 or 70 minutes or so, I'll be happy to moderate our discussion. Is the future electric ? Strategies for e-buses in the context of climate action and imposed austerity. Now that's the title of our event, so I was wondering whether we can take this question mark into an exclamation mark, or maybe underscore this question mark. Now, Dr. Zishang has said that in the past years the public funding has been significantly boosted, especially for electric buses that have indeed been funded out of these sources. And it's true that in the future the public transport sector does require public funds as well in order to shoulder the investments that are required for the ramp-up of e-mobility, as Mr. Erfurt has rightly said. But what would the corona pandemic and the strain on public budgets really mean? Do we have less room for maneuver? Does it mean that we cannot ramp up e-mobility as we were planning to, or is there too much pressure on climate action and therefore we will continue? And how can earlier investments in the public transport sector be safeguarded and continued? Because we don't want to stop here where we're in the process of bringing things up to full capacity. And what about electric driving ranges? These are issues. Or what about alternative drivetrains, not only battery electric vehicles, but also looking at new technologies for regional and intercity operations. Now, ladies and gentlemen, if you have any questions, you might want to ask them. We use the Slido tool as a Q&A forum. So if you go to sly.do and punch in your questions from there, I think this is going to be an interesting discussion. So if there's anything you would like to share with us, please leave it there. And now, with that, I'd like to welcome our 4 participants here on the panel and may ask you to come forward. Once again, I'd like to welcome Dr. Tamara Zishang. She's a State Secretary at the Federal Ministry of Transport and Digital Infrastructure. Welcome. And then, once again, I welcome Rolf Erfurt, who's the Head of Operations at Berliner Verkehrsbetriebe, BVG for short. Welcome. Next is Patrick Kurt, Head of Political Affairs at Flixbus, the Flixbus operator, who is the umbrella organization also for Flixtrain. Mr. Kurt has worked there since 2015. Welcome. And we have Dr. Frederick Zohm, Head of Research and Development at MAN Truck and Bus. Since July 2017 he has been in this position, but earlier he has also worked in the commercial vehicles business. Welcome. Mr. Erfurt, now that was a clear political commitment we have just heard, as it refers to funding coming from public funding sources, and you're currently negotiating a new transportation agreement, you have said, with Berlin. But do you see that on the state or regional level there's just as much of a strict commitment for the funding and the climate campaign and action programs as we've seen in the federal government? Now, when we talk about Berlin, in the next 15 years, 19 billion euros will be invested in public transport. Well, obviously not only for electric buses and their technology, and not even just bus operations, but it covers the entire portfolio of our transport undertaking. But it's a huge amount of money, of course. I see a pronounced political will when it comes to changeover to emissions-free drivetrains. And we'll see how that goes. You will see once we receive the money and all the bills are paid and our buses are on the road, we'll see how that works. But it is certainly clear we see that political support. It's true not only for the transportation sector, but also in the finance sector, where now the right course is being selected, is being taken, and this is quite in line with what we see from the federal government. We are seeing and hearing the clear signals, not only in terms of transport policy, but also financial policies. Of course, it would then also require us to rethink new forms of financing. Maybe we need to bring OEMs on board. Maybe you're not just paying for the bus once you receive it and it sits in your depot, but you only pay it by use, right, or by kilometer driven. So this is actually something that we're discussing at the moment with manufacturers to, if you will, get a healthy mix of a good political will, a commercial will, and also the funds that are available for that. Now, Dr. Zishang, earlier you gave us some numbers. 1 billion euros was one of the figures that you put up here. And the federal government, both in the climate action program and in the stimulus package, has committed itself to e-mobility and is ready and willing to spend this 1 billion euros. And now the funding guideline is also within the responsibility of your ministry and no longer with the environmental ministry as it used to be the case. How far have we come when it comes to notification of that guideline for Brussels? So where do we go from here? What's the timeline?
Okay. Dann haben wir die technischen Fragen auch geklärt. Nein, sehr gerne.
I'm certainly happy to take that one because this 1 billion euros is just a number that has been floated and people have expectations there to see when that money will be available, and indeed we will put up a grant bid very soon. We're working on the guidelines and are also talking to Brussels as we speak. The plan is that at the beginning of next year we can get started with a funding guideline. Let me come back to that point I mentioned before. We want to be open, unbiased in terms of new technologies, electric buses, hydrogen, fuel cells that is. There's also going to be an option to convert diesel buses to electric ones. This is eligible for the first time, pending final approval, but this at least are the considerations, the ideas we have in that guideline. But in addition to bus investments, there's also options to support funding for charging infrastructure, or possibly also where towns and cities first need to develop a concept. They need to understand what combinations of transport is available. These concepts are eligible as well for grants. As in earlier guidelines, there will be plans to offer direct grants. So for everything we support, we are covering the extra investments cost vis-à-vis a diesel bus, and this is a common procedure. So in terms of extra costs, these will be funded directly. So if ever companies want to invest in new buses, up to 80% of the extra cost is then feasible or eligible for funding. For infrastructure, the eligibility is 40%, for concepts is 50%. These are common schemes that have already existed before. But our impression is that the notification in Brussels will clearly also follow the principle that we are supporting here the economy. We are stimulating the economy, and this is why our colleagues from Brussels are following our line of reasoning as well. And they're working full speed to provide that notification. Thank you very much, and we'll come back later on during the discussion to alternative technologies. But let me play it back to Mr. Erfurt first. Mr. Zishang has just said funding the extra costs is eligible, and also charging infrastructure can be funded in order to compensate your operational expenses that are obviously higher. In the Netherlands, 20% more buses are needed because for in-service charging you have certain downtimes of vehicles that need to be compensated for. So where do you see the advantages both in driving ranges, in charging times, in order still to be efficient? Because this is also the cost that you have to absorb as a transport company. There are multiple levels to that question. We have electric buses here in Berlin under special use scenarios. We don't have any, interurban operation where you could also recuperate energy for the battery. Whereas in Berlin we run in city traffic with short distances. We currently have an electric driving range of 100 kilometers, where a normal diesel bus travels 400 kilometers a day. Right, so we're not really on a par with this technology. Now we work with OEMs in order to improve electric driving ranges, and our own company needs to clean up its act and develop the concept to optimize the route network with those driving capabilities that those buses have. And we need to understand that we need to reorganize our route scheduling. We're still using very old ways of thinking, so we could use a number of demand data combined with artificial intelligence in order to intelligently plan route maps and networks and combine them with the availability of buses and to bring costs down as well. But what is clear is we need to liaise with OEMs. 400 kilometers driving range is probably not possible at the moment with electric buses. When we're back here in 5 or 6 years' time, perhaps yes, we're talking about comparable driving ranges, but not now. But other than that, we obviously have additional operational expenses that we need to recoup as well. Now, Mr. Sohm, industry players have been mentioned a couple of times now, so let's ask you, where do you see the prospects of increasing electric driving ranges for buses, and what is your development decision that you have taken? Yeah, range is one, cost is another topic, of course, and when it comes to driving ranges, and again, this is different from manufacturer to manufacturer, depends on the topology of a city. So Berlin may be an advantage here compared to undulated terrain like in Pforzheim or Stuttgart. But Mr. Effort says 150 kilometers is a realistic driving range. Well, our new bus, the MAN Line City E that we're launching right now for 12-meter buses and also for 18-meter buses, we're coming in at conditions like today, a relatively warm day, no air conditioning, no winter, no snow. 250, 270 kilometers would be a best-case scenario of driving ranges. That would come down, of course, in day-to-day operations, but we want to guarantee 200 kilometers of driving range. This depends on a flat topology, of course, not in a hilly city. But I'm saying at the same time, this is only the first step. We've had 100 years of diesel engine innovation, but this massive upheaval now to the industry means that we need to do more. Obviously, MAN is part of the Volkswagen AG. We are committed to e-mobility. Mr. Dies has said that on a number of occasions, and we make this technology edge available to our customers. We're only just beginning to work in this area. And when it comes to lithium-ion batteries, we've come a long way already. But I think this will go further. In 25, 27, we see more incremental increases in battery technology. Maybe we come up with something else. This is what we're engineers for, and we like and we love R&D. But it would be premature now to make any promises at this point. All of us are interested in meeting the Paris Climate Accord to go to zero emissions by 2050. So actually our fleets have to be ready by 2040, whereas no diesel vehicles may be sold even by then already in order to achieve the 2051. So when it comes to driving ranges, I'm pretty sure we make progress. And then we'll see at some point an intersecting harmonization. BVG needs to proactively control its route map work, and then we'll see how we can deliver against that. But you, as a bus and truck maker, can you influence battery technology? Because that is a major hinge point for driving range. We also made mention of auxiliary equipment, and for those who are configuring the bus need to decide what they want in a product. But how far have you come to negotiate with battery cell manufacturers? Is there anything that you can do to influence them? Well, of course, this is what we call manufacturer-specific, but the VW Group produces 10 million vehicles. We're going all in electric, and that also means that cell manufacturers turn an avid ear to what we have, to what we expect and what we want to build. We're doing truck and bus manufacturing. Of course, this is smaller in terms of volume, but we can benefit from what the larger corporation does. If we were just a bus maker or just a truck maker, probably the battery manufacturers wouldn't listen to us. But I think we're interesting for them as a segment. We all need to put our shoulder to the wheel here, I'm sure. Both when it comes to performance, energy utilization, driving ranges, costs, etc. And then at the end of the day, it must be an integrated system. Energy management was important for energy control in diesel buses, and it will just be as important, even more important, in electric vehicles, avoiding thermal losses, always being highly efficient in driving, etc. Now, Mr. Kurt, electric driving ranges has been mentioned. Very important for you because you're traveling on long-haul roads, because your average driving ranges per trip are longer than what public transport does in a day. So, where do you see your role as a long-haul operator? Well, we've had experience with a number of electric buses, also talked to manufacturers, and I must say at the moment as we speak it's still a disaster. But that's no problem, because we're only in the infancy of its development. You know, back in 1910 our buses were not advanced to go all the way in one trip from Berlin to Munich. Maybe we are in a similar situation right now. There's a lot of development in front of us, ahead of us, and I think many things will still change, be it electric buses, hydrogen buses or anything else. But every bus, every coach that we have had here in Germany, one electric, two in France, we're planning also for some more in Poland. For all of them, we had to pay ourselves because we didn't know who was going to foot the bill, because it's our innovation, right? We wanted to be the first one who operate electric touring coaches in the world, not only on a test track, but really in regular service, line haul, people buying tickets to travel from A to B, and we offer an electric option. And the accreditation or the registration requirements were very comprehensive, of course. An electric coach was ready at Rotterdam port, but didn't get a road license because it came from China. We cannot build buses like those in Europe. This is something we had to learn the hard way. So that Chinese coach is a Chinese one. It does what it's supposed to do, 150 kilometers, 200 kilometers. And when we started with electric buses, the driving range was at 80. So that was 2 years before we started our project. So imagine it more than doubled within 2 years only. And we planned to operate that project for 1 year on a route between Frankfurt and Mannheim. And after 1 year we decided we're not going to continue with it because there were some glitches in the technology of that bus and the public interest was very restrained. I mean, we have bus line 200 here in Berlin, just past our office. Very interesting, beautiful buses there, bigger, smaller. Some of them are white, some are yellow, some have a pantograph on the roof. But we don't have that option to play around and test. We need to know exactly when a coach can run. Every registration takes us 3 months. The deregistration of a line also takes me 3 months. And for us, as a young, dynamic IT company, we need to be much more flexible. So therefore, we put that project on the back burner, but we'll see how it goes from here. We'll be the first ones to order, 10 electric buses. We'll be happy to get a change over to 100% electric fleet. But you just said alternative fuels. Are you also looking into other technology, hydrogen, fuel cell, natural gas, CNG? Are you following that up as well, or are you just on the battery electric vehicle track? Well, what matters is how long can a coach travel with one charge, how quickly can you charge it or recharge it, and that depends on the driving times of our driver. 4.5 hours then they have to take a 45 minutes break. If you get a bus or coach from A to B, Berlin is great. Can go in that time from north to Hamburg, south to Dresden or Leipzig, then obviously you can do that. So while the driver has a break, you recharge. The bus that we had took 4.5 hours to recharge. Now, that is not very helpful. It is just good as a learning experience, but it's not good at all for line haul service. But, I mean, if there's any other concept that is just as alternative as battery electric, would you do that? Of course, hydrogen is fine. Filling up a hydrogen bus in 10 minutes is no problem. Okay, what does the industry think? There have been some hypes here and there with hydrogen and fuel cells, but then 3 or 4 years ago it had completely vanished from the radar screen and everyone was just solely focusing on battery electric buses, at least for city buses. But now there are some operators who have bought 10 or 20 units of fuel cell buses, use fuel cells possibly also as range extenders, because they think this is a reasonable option. So these come now also increasingly into city bus operators. What about MAN? I realize there are different manufacturers and different philosophies. It always depends on your use case and where you want to use your buses and coaches. For buses in cities, I clearly see a preference for electric vehicles. We still have conventional vehicles on the road, private vehicle traffic, delivery vans in the inner cities, and you need to decide as a city administration how do you want to bring the different fuel or drivetrain technologies together. And for this we need the relevant infrastructure. Mr. Effort is well advised to say, well, why don't we open our depot for charging infrastructure to other users as well? I mean, if you have electric trucks, they have to be charged somewhere. And this is a bit of a challenge to have that infrastructure available once we get started. And we're getting started now. The technologies are there. VW has launched the ID.3. Competitors are also there, BEVs. Some things we've been waiting for a long time are now available. And then it gets very tight for city utilities to roll out another range of electric infrastructure, charging facilities. So that infrastructure concept is within the purview of a city administration. And there are some who say, well, we can't do it unless we also invest in hydrogen and fuel cells. Hydrogen allows us to distribute energy quickly. Charging times is much quicker. Now we're going up to 150 kilowatts of inductive charging. We're attending standardization commissions to go up to 750 kilowatts of charging. This is the only way for truck manufacturers to get really reasonable and feasible charging times, depending on the driving and rest times of drivers. So we need much more than 350 kilowatts than the passenger cars need at the moment. So yes, we see a growth trajectory where battery electric buses are the foundation for city operations. There are a number of valid use cases, and we can make this new transport policy a reality. And then that's where range extenders become interesting. You can install a fuel cell on an existing electric platform. That is possible. And we need good durability or service life. You guys from Flixbus, of course, when you operate coaches, will be disappointed if your asset doesn't give the service life promise. A fuel cell must be much more durable than 6,000 hours. That's what it delivers today, but if you replace it, that's expensive. So in that sense, fuel cells are still limited. We're working on that as well. We have a number of concepts. Battery electric for buses, and then more for other vehicles. And there's traditional technologies. Diesel engines are efficient. We have mild hybrid concepts that can be put on top of that. We can talk about natural gas, biogas. So we need a plurality of technical solutions. We need to be open for solutions that make sense in a given use case scenario and to different profiles. Mr. Erfurt, Berlin has a very comprehensive bus network, different topologies, different vehicle concepts, as we've realized. Now, how far does battery electric buses make sense here in Berlin, maybe with in-service charging, or would you also need alternative concepts like contact line charging with pantographs, gas, etc.? So what is the variety that you're looking looking at in order to design a bus network in Berlin electrically or alternatively. Our decision for the moment was to continue with e-mobility. It doesn't rule out at all that if we believe that hydrogen technology or fuel cells are more advanced, then we change over to those as well or add them into the balance. And I'm going back to what I said before. At some point you have to be bold enough and finally take a decision, full stop. And people ask me very often about hydrogen, and then I said, wait a moment. For the moment we decided on electric. If use cases turn out to be valid for hydrogen, I'm certainly happy to come back to that. It makes no sense at all now just to change our diesel trucks for hydrogen, where you still have fuel tank cars that come in every day in order to top up your filling station. I don't see any environmental effect. So once again, in a nutshell, our focus at the moment is electric mobility, but we're certainly open to embrace also alternative concepts in the future if they make sense for us. So what else do we need to convert our fleets? Now here in Berlin we are operating double-decker buses, and we're getting another 200 new double-deckers in the next year, and they have Euro 6 diesel engines. We don't have an electric one, electrically powered one, double-deckers that is, and we'll do a feasibility study soon to see what options will be available for emissions-free drivetrain solutions. And yes, we're also looking at contact wire charging. In Spandau, we're trying to put up a test track. But as I said before, we're lucky enough to just do it. And I'm not sure if this is going to be the solution. Technology does not stand still. But maybe for larger vehicles, a bendy bus with an extension, maybe we test and try something that is new, which comes with a whole string of additional accreditation and registrations and approvals that it requires. And we will do feasibility studies, and I cannot tell you now whether it's going to work or not. Ms. Zishang, earlier you said that you have no preference for certain technologies, so the funding guideline also includes options for hydrogen / fuel cells. Is that a contradiction to Germany's hydrogen strategy? Is that in line with keeping all the options open? Because this is true for industry policy when it comes to battery production technology, hydrogen technology. So do you agree with the Ministry of Economic Affairs on this one? In fact, we're doing both. And therefore what I'm saying is, what drivetrain decision, is taken by someone who makes the investment, that person needs to know what makes economic sense. Learn from you, Mr. Erfurt, that the same is true with electric mobility. How do you charge your vehicle? Where? In a depot, or with your new bendy buses on the 200 line, you can charge it elsewhere, actually in the streets. Or if you have a pantograph or contact wire buses, that will have an impact on the appearance of your city architecture. It's not only economic decisions, but you're actually intervening in the public architecture if you make infrastructure available where people can see it. Possibly when they can, other people may use it as well. So even if you're just focusing on one technology, batteries, it comes up with a whole lot of additional questions and decisions to be taken. This is why we are open for different concepts. And this is also why I think every city, every town and city needs to decide on themselves what concept makes sense and what dovetailed, what customized concept you want to go for. And then, as we were talking about ranges, driving ranges, we don't know where the developments are headed in battery technology, and more leaps, I think, will be happening. But what might happen is that in the final analysis, hydrogen might be the best answer for a given town or city. So we are always saying, it's not for the state, it's not for the government to decide, it's the market forces that will. Depends on what OEMs can provide, what the pricing is, So there's loads of different conditions that need to be factored in before you take a commercial decision on where you're going to invest. And we don't want to preclude or preempt any decisions by saying we're supporting only one technology. We would like to leave it open. No technological bias for a commercial decision making to be taken. And obviously also regional and long-distance coach operations can also participate from this funding guideline, if I understand it correctly. That is certainly true. I mean, 50% live in a city, but 50% live in urban or rural areas, and then these are these overlapping areas like the wealthy suburbs, and we need to cater to all of them. And there was something that has been addressed before, pricing for vehicles. I mean, if you look at what's happening in the Netherlands or in Scandinavia, there are some cities that they're putting up tenders for dozens or hundreds of electric vehicles. Now, do we see a similar situation in industry? Are you leveraging economies of scales that prices can go down for electric vehicles? Not yet, I'm afraid. Carbon-free mobility also requires the acquiescence for all of us to say that diesel engines are so inexpensive, so efficient at the moment price-wise, that it's very hard to beat. Otherwise we wouldn't have developed it for so many years. And now there's a new technology when it comes to infrastructure is at a certain level of advancement. And obviously our VW group parent company helps us in that. People like Mr. Erfurt want us to develop further, to get more advanced with our and efficient with our technology. And our performance has to be right. We have to reinvest the money that we make with selling our products. And those investments are huge. In the past, we just had to work on diesel technology. Today, we still need to work on diesel. Diesel is not going to disappear, and a number of steps have been agreed with the EU Commission for diesel engines. So I think diesel engines will be around for another 15 to 20 years. So that we need to work on, plus all the new technologies on top of that. Hydrogen is what we just mentioned. Natural gas, possibly, we want to continue. Maybe biogas. That costs real money as well. And we need to recoup those investments as well. So when it comes to pricing, we're only just getting started, and I wouldn't expect that in 1 year's time we're down and we are on a par with conventional technologies. Probably not. It's not just a single responsibility for one single institution. It's something for society at large. For all of the global community, we want to be carbon neutral by 2050. Now let's all do that together. And it's only fair in that discussion to say that if you want to change mobility patterns, that costs money. You need to spread the burden across different shoulders, also for those who are at the end of the value chain. I can only support that. Don't forget that diesel engines can be very environmentally friendly. I mean, this is something that people tend to forget in our discussion. Flixbus uses 100% Euro 6 engines, which is cleaner than Deutsche Bahn, the rail operator. And the Federal Environmental Agency has pointed that out. But we don't even stop here. We want to move ahead. So people who want to be environmentally friendly in local and long-distance traffic, we have to offer something. And expensive electric buses just can't deliver at the moment. It will be no good for Mr. Erfurt to invest a lot of money in Berlin for an e-bus that runs at 30 minutes intervals. It's not good, and people will change over or change back to their cars. So you have to have an interval of 10 minutes, and that you do with the latest generation clean diesel engine. Why not? But by the same token, and I'm saying that to Ms. Zishang, there is a difference between public transport and public long-distance transport and touring coaches in terms of how they are going to be supported. Because if you operate a line haul business, regular services, then there's not too much of a difference between local transport and that public long-distance transport. They should be treated equally. We need to understand that the law makes mention of that as well. Our electric bus that traveled from Frankfurt to Mannheim was not exempt from the renewables reallocation charge, but the railway operator was, Deutsche Bahn. So it was electric buses that are no longer exempt from paying the renewables reallocation charge, although not a single bus at the moment, or at the time, had been on the roads. So it doesn't make any sense. So I remember as we had our first electric bus in Germany, the highest ranking politician, and I'm not blaming anyone, the highest ranking politician we had there was the local mayor of Mannheim. And that was a good thing, and we're really grateful he was there. But then you're wondering, as an economic operator, why are we doing that? We're investing a lot of money here. We don't really get that political support. I mean, in Frankfurt we had a local MP, and then we had that mayor of that city of Mannheim, and no one else. Again, we're not doing it for a mayor, we're not doing it for a minister if he had come. But it's still part of the truth also is, if we are paying our share of a social challenge or societal challenge, it would be really helpful to get recognition for what we're doing, and we're certainly happy to. Now, Ms. Zishang, the renewables reallocation charge was also something that was addressed in Cabinet yesterday, and apparently the coalition hasn't quite delivered against its promises in the coalition agreement by exempting electric buses from the renewables reallocation charge. Did anybody address this issue? Well, as we have said years before, any bills in Parliament will be modified. The parliamentary procedures are only just beginning, so we still see changes. Therefore, a cabinet decision has been taken, and it is a proposal now, more than anything. The Renewable Energies Act is a very comprehensive piece of legislation, and all of you know how difficult it is to talk about exemptions or caveats. If you take one out, someone else will pay extra. And then every individual case of an exemption or a non-exemption, there are arguments pro and con. What is important is that at the end we arrive at a comprehensive integrated system. We don't want to have some who pay all of the reallocation charges and others that don't. It's straddling a line really every time to see who needs to be in and who can be out. Let's come back to the alternatives, because biogas has been mentioned as one potential alternative, and the extra costs of converting a bus to gas can also be eligible for grants. So is there any mention made in that funding guideline in addition to electric mobility? Well, I'm not aware of all of the facets of the funding guidelines because they're not finalized yet. But if it says alternative drivetrain, then that means we have no technological bias and anything is possible. We talked about conversion of vehicles as well, and that is going to be eligible as well. Mr. Erfurt, could you imagine you take parts of your existing fleet and convert it to electric drivetrains, no matter whether that will be funded or not? But do you think if it's technologically feasible, would you do it? Well, our focus at the moment is the purchasing of new vehicles, really. So typically we have a bus for 10 years in our fleet with an overall mileage of 1 million kilometers, and it's not the engine or the motor that is at fault then, but really mechanical parts, chassis, etc. So we purchase new vehicles. Conversion is not on the top of our agenda, and it may be different for other operators where the driving or the mileages are different, or they have a different fleet, but we just focus first and foremost on new vehicles. Now, Mr. Zohm, you prefer to sell new vehicles, I'm sure, but would you see the potential in Germany for a conversion market? So you have produced many modern diesel buses. They should not be devalued. So do you think there's an option to convert those to electric? Oh, I'm sure there'll be resourceful people that can do that, and operators that would be happy to go for it. It's not our business anyway, because people expect us to deliver MAN quality and performance, and that we can only do with those specific vehicle concepts across all the dimensions and weight ratios. When we talk about 12-meter solo buses, there are 6 roof-mounted batteries. That is 3.6 tons of extra weight. And if you do that on an existing bus, you get too much load onto the front axle when you brake. No driver would love to have that. So therefore, what you get from us is a specific optimized concept which is energy efficient, something that says, here's the performance characteristics. Now, but why is conversion mentioned in the funding guideline? Obviously, there are a number of suppliers out there that have conversion projects on offer. Do you really think there's market potential? Well, why not? Why should we define what's possible and what's not? There's something out there in the marketplace that's being used, and why not? We think this is an option to make climate action possible. And this is why we didn't want to preclude certain options. How many people are using them? I cannot say, of course, but I know there are positive cases where this has worked in the past. So we wanted to make that possible rather than banning options from happening. Now, ladies and gentlemen, I would like to give you the chance again to get involved here. I'd like to encourage you to put your questions into our chat here, and I did get quite a few of them and address them to the audience here before. Now, here's a question that someone has asked. Do you think if there's a certain critical amount or volume or number of people living in a city before it gets interesting to really turn electric? So, Mr. Söben, is there any order of magnitude, or could you start from bus number 1? Well, it depends on what your use case is. If you're operating intercity coaches, I don't think there's really a competitive use case at the moment where it would make economic sense. But if a driving range of 200 kilometers is enough for you, then, as a consumer, we can certainly go for that. E-mobility is an integrated system. This has been said before, in the sense that we need infrastructure, charging infrastructure, and we also earlier talked about the approval process and all the procedures. Now, what about charging infrastructure in a city location? What would you wish for in Berlin? Where should optimizations be made? Well, for one thing, we have traditional planning approval procedures. That's a major issue when we want to establish contact wire buses, and obviously because that requires infrastructure that intervenes into city architecture or the appearance of the city, or take approval processes for depots. I mean, you buy a piece of land, then you start groundbreaking, and it takes a while until your buses can arrive in the depot. There are too many years, literally years in between before that becomes possible. So it's planning approval, it's building documentation review. It's just a lot. It's a long, drawn-out process. And I'm not just apportioning blame to the federal or local administrators. It's really a shared effort for all of us. Construction companies, contractors, all of us have to be in the same boat. We have to make our own homework here, if you will. But Ms. Zishang earlier said there was a roundtable discussion. Well, we need those discussions with all the experts in the industry to make sure here's what we all need to do together, and we all have our role to play. So it's just what you said. Everyone has their role to play. What about the acceptance of others? Is there anything else in addition to construction approval or planning approval? Does the public also support what you're doing? Do they accept when it comes to, the NIMBY principle and the infrastructure? Well, I must say we haven't had any bad experience yet. I think there will be a problem if you have trolley buses or contact wire buses, but I don't see that at the moment. When it comes to bus depots, we're actually getting positive feedback at our big new depot outside Indira Gandhi Strasse, which is right in a built-up area, and people tell us, well, we don't hear that much anymore. It's much quieter. That's the type of positive feedback we're having. So that is good news. And as Ms. Zishang has said, we also have some infrastructure stations, charging stations here in the inner city with the pantographs. And obviously that's not here at Paris-Platz in the center of Berlin. So we have our facility at Herzele, which is just behind the zoo train stations. So we don't place our infrastructure directly where people would see it. But so far we haven't received any residents' complaints from there. Now, you obviously know, Mr. Söben, that you have decided on just doing overnight charging for e-buses, and as a single solution. But does that fit the requirements of all operators? Well, of course, we talked to the operators before, to our customers, and asked them, what would your ideal use case be? And, buses don't travel at night, not too many of them anyway, we know that. So overnight charging, we thought, was the right first way forward. And this is not chiseled in stone, it might still change, because there are cities that need in-service charging during the day. And then if you run a route network like Berlin, then you would have 6 to 8 or how many of these charging stations in the city somewhere. Mr. Erfurt? Now, as we talk about charging infrastructure, let us not forget that it's not only about depots. There may be other places where we can charge our vehicles. Maybe during the day, say, we use those big car parks with an existing charging infrastructure where private cars or residents are charging their vehicles, or fleet customers. And at night, when they're not needed, maybe we can charge our buses. Why not? Mr. Kurt? Well, but that is a big challenge. Building up new charging stations, we're talking about electric buses, and where would you charge them if you have large fleets of them? And also, don't forget, we need high voltage cables. At the train station of Mannheim, we thought there must be a cable somewhere in the ground. We had a very hard time finding someone who would help us to connect a high voltage cable to the bus terminal, which is right next to the train station. Or in Frankfurt, at the station, we didn't have no charging station at all. And I'm sure this can be resolved technically, but these are fundamental basic problems. And then you're wondering, who's going to help us in that? Well, you'll be in a different position than a municipal operator, because city buses go in a certain limited route network with their depots, but you're spread across the country. So how do you address charging infrastructure for intercity coach operators? Well, there's not too much of a difference there, because we operate regular services as well. We operate under the same legislation, different section in the law though, but we need to talk to the municipal administrators. It was the city utilities in Mannheim that helped us to build that charging station, thanks not least of all to the local mayor, who said, well, buses were invented in Germany, in Mannheim, he said, and therefore I want to have the first electric bus operator here. But we didn't have one in Frankfurt, as I said. Mannheim is a great case in point. I'm not complaining at all, but we want to roll it out across the country. So we had something like that here when the bus terminal in Berlin was converted, and we asked, where will the infrastructure be? Now, in Berlin you find a number of options to charge your vehicles, be it with electricity, with hydrogen or gas. But if you go to a rural community like the town of Fürstenberg or somewhere else, you cannot expect to have everything there, hydrogen and others. Or, not to forget, when we talk about modern bus operations, maybe for those routes we do use diesel engines because they're efficient, they're fuel efficient, and you can go there and back and do not need to charge or fill up somewhere on the route. Because we don't want to carry empty electric coaches around, we want to carry people at a reasonable price, at an economical price. And this is the advantage of any regular line haul service. So charging infrastructure, we think, is something that people should work on, rather than just think about buses per se. We had also a question asked earlier about charging infrastructure here. You've had your experience with inductive charging, and you stopped that test, as far as I understand, both in terms of the visibility of charging infrastructure. That's quite less obtrusive than, say, the pantograph structures or the overhead contact wires. But why was it that you stopped that test for inductive charging? Just like in Mannheim, you're not going to pursue that any further, I understand. Well, we've seen that technology is moving ahead, and there's now other options to charge electric buses. So it was for that reason that we said we are going to not pursue it anymore. I mean, people using different solutions for trams, as far as I know, they have inductive charging. You don't need a contact wire, and you charge your batteries at the intermediate stops, and there's a number of OEMs who provide such a technology. We didn't consider it to be reasonable for buses, and we thought there's other cheaper ways to do that. But anyway, we tested it, we tried it, it didn't work for us, and we learned a lot, no doubt about it. But when we said we focus on something else. Mr. Zom? There's another thought that I'd like to inject into the debate. You see, we're really on a good track, and the governments have helped us a lot. Of course, there are many funding sources, not only from the federal but also for the regional operators. So we're on the way to changing the paradigm of transport policy, and many good things are being done. And obviously you're always smarter after the fact, but again, as I said, we're on a good way forward, have had good experience, and you're expecting industrial scale application because you want to travel on an electric bus to work and back home. But let us not forget there's one more thing. It's not only technological change, it's a change of energy supply and energy generation. Now in Germany, the CO2 share of primary energy production is still 30%. So an electric bus will be doing no good in terms of climate action. If you want to go down to zero carbon emissions by 2050, we have to change our energy balance. We need to be faster in order to bring that share down. Otherwise, our technologies are great and our electricity still has 30% of fossil fuel. That's an absolutely valid point, and we got one of those questions as well here on the Slido question. Is there any coordination and alignment within your ministry and between the different ministries in Germany when it comes to that question? Absolutely. And the same is also true for our hydrogen strategy that you mentioned before. If you do hydrogen electrolysis, you need electricity as well in order to generate that hydrogen. Now, 3 or 4 years ago, we did a lot of energy policies. 4 or 5 years ago, we had a discussion that maybe because of more energy efficiency technologies, we need less power in the future. That is not true. Obviously, we need to continue to improve the energy efficiency, but we know we need more power. And electromobility in the past was considered to be an energy storage system, but energy storage or intermediate energy storage is just not enough. We have to go way beyond. We need more electric mobility, for which we need much more electricity than we originally thought. And the same will be true for hydrogen, or the use of hydrogen in industry. Now, this is why we have come up with a number of programs to look at developing alternative energies. Where can we expand those green energies? Let's take offshore wind energy, for instance. So quite a few more support programs for renewable energies. And also in the Baltic Sea area, this is where you generate renewable wind energy, but you don't need it there. You need the grids to bring that energy to other parts of the country. So a lot can still be done in energy production, and we've increased efficiencies. But still, when it comes to infrastructure decisions for power grids, we're still not by far not where we need to go. Also earlier we talked about the imposed austerity, as the name of our discussions suggests. Is that going to be a reality also with shrinking budgets? So we're not only supporting e-mobility, but possibly also the new energy policies, the energy turnaround. Do we have enough funds? Because it's not only the little problem, in inverted commas, of electric buses, but there's a much more omnibus question, if you will. The energy transition is a huge mega project. Do we have enough means and resources for the next 10 or 20 years? Well, it's very hard to forecast what's happening in the next 10 to 20 years. And no one expected a pandemic earlier this year, so you have to be very careful making forecasts, especially, as they say, if they're concerning the future. I think, though, that our national hydrogen strategy is a good case in point. We're going to spend 7 billion euros to support projects. Something that's very good about in Germany is that we have done a lot of lab testing of technologies. We know they work on a lab scale, but we're lacking the economies of scale, the massive application of those technologies. Now, in terms of hydrogen, we were a pioneer for the transportation sector. We had numerous projects with hydrogen applications, test beds, marketable solutions. A lot has been done. But then, if you want to establish electrolysis, hydrogen electrolysis for power generation, for the steel industry, for the chemical industry, well, we're in our infancy. Not much has been achieved there, but it's still good and right as a way forward to now invest means, resources to make such renewable energy generation possible. Because at some point you need steel for building your buses, you need the steel industry, so they're all related, intertwined with one another. But this, as I said before, is a powerful statement that has been made by the government with a financial commitment. The hydrogen strategy, the national hydrogen strategy has been adopted this year with all the financial ramifications that this has, and also the federal budgets have a number of lines referring to those strategies. Now, we know full well that finances may be shrinking. They probably will be shrinking in the future, but still we make no compromise on those strategic lines going forward. Mr. Kurt, one more thing I'd like to mention here. Often we talk about financial grants, programs, funding sources, they are certainly there. But then you go to the Federal Ministry of Transport and when you say, yeah, we want to do it. We want to establish an electric intercity coach line. We want to build one because they're not built in Germany, but we want to operate one. And then people sit in front of me and said, okay, according to which funding guideline? And we, as a young smart startup, what's a funding guideline? We do a bus, we do a stop, a regular service, line haul, and all you need to do is to help us, please. How are we going to get it done? And to be quite honest, and then comes the German public servant who says, okay, now first of all you need to fill in an application form and then we're going to help you. I mean, I'm generalizing here, but this is exactly the problem that we're facing. And then you said, oh, come on, let's do it ourselves. And then they say, if you can do it yourself, why are you asking the ministry? But, this is not what we mean. We want to get things done together, and that I find is sometimes difficult in this country. Plenty of different funding sources, but accessing those funds is not that easy. All of our electric bus projects have been rejected. Maybe that was our fault as well, but maybe they should have helped us and said, look, this is a common endeavor. Let's do it together to make sure that in the future we operate intercity coaches electrically in Germany and not in America or in China. I mean, take Tesla as a case in point. They've been clearing an entire forest in the Berlin area without having the final approval for their factory yet. So they appear in Germany, said, we want to get rid of that forest, and there we go. That forest is gone without having the final approval. But the factory is almost there. Smart, cool, very well done. It seems to work in Brandenburg and Berlin and Germany, but only if you're an American company. Ms. Zishang, let's come to the pooling efforts of one single funding guideline, and I think, is that all cut and dried for 2021? Yeah, now for bus support we have a single funding source. Obviously different ministries have been working on that, and authorities, for a number of reasons, political convenience, and sometimes ministries have been pursuing a similar approach here. But let me come back to something that I'd like to mention as a taxpayer. He who wants to get money from the state needs to know what needs to be done in order to claim those funds. As a citizen, we can expect that you know how to do that. And obviously, we can also provide consultancy and help you in that. But you need to take your own initiative as well. But I'm certainly happy to take that criticism on board. There have been a number of federal support programs that come with a consultancy arm. NOW is a company that provides consultancy for the hydrogen economy. Same is true for charging infrastructure, which is focused very much on passenger cars, and I'm not quite sure if you offer something for other industries there. We have a national coordination office for charging infrastructure, which very much focuses on private, i.e. passenger cars. And I don't know at the moment whether we can provide consultancy to companies like yours. I mean, it would be plausible for you, and would be good to know who your go-to person is locally, who may have had an experience in the public charging infrastructure. So again, I know everyone has the right to claim good expertise to be given to them, but it really depends on the industry in which you work. Now, let me follow up on one question here. There's also a target group for whom we haven't spoken yet, which is the small operators, small and medium-sized enterprises of bus or coach operators. They don't work on a large scale. They need to buy individual buses and get licenses. Now, for for them, if they want to claim financial support, they don't have the critical mass of both vehicles and business. Is there any provision in the funding guideline to apply those support mechanisms also for the smaller players? Is there a level playing field for everyone, no matter how big your bus fleet is? Well, in that type of funding or support, you have to be careful. Otherwise, you might be distorting the competitive landscape one way or the other. It is a rather complex balancing act. So this is why our colleagues from Brussels always take a close look, and we need to notify everything we do in order to avoid any competition or distortion. So why should you fund one person more, although they buy fewer vehicles? That makes no sense. It's not quite flexible. But it's not acceptable for someone who is only buying smaller volumes is not eligible for funding, because that happens in some programs where you have a minimum eligibility amount. Now, in our case, these are not relevant because buses cost a lot of money anyway to start with. So no, I don't think there should be a minimum ordering volume of vehicles, of buses, but to say that SMEs get a higher eligibility or higher funding quota than others, I don't think that it would make sense. Now, Mr. Kurt, let me come back to your business model. You work with coach operators, partners. You don't operate any bus really, although for the electric program you did. Now, what is your experience partnering with your coach operators and suggest e-mobility to them? And if there were electric coaches in the marketplace, how would you make sure that your contractors use them? How would that work? Well, that can be quite varied. You have to distinguish between the pre- and post-corona situation. At the moment, the situation is disastrous. They are fighting for survival, those coach operators, so we cannot offer them electric right now. But unless we're looking ahead now, we will end up in a situation that our network planning is just focusing on moving people around. I mean, that makes sense, but we want to be environmentally friendly. We want to have a green footprint. With our diesel buses that we have now, that can be done. But we want to go the extra mile because we have looked at biogas-powered buses, and in that case, our municipal utilities in the towns and cities, and we had a case like that in Hesse, that are supporting us in that. And they said, okay, if you were to operate a gas coach, you can use our utility depots, and that's a unique way to do that. I mean, we ourselves are not ready and willing to do it on our own account for 150 or 200,000 euros of a price premium of extra cost that such a bus would cost. Now, if we want it, if contractors want it, if society wants it, well, there must be funding means to make that possible. And then why don't we split up costs and have a whip round, as it were? That's possible. And that is a task for all of us in the future. At some point, we'll have operators like BVG in Berlin that will operate renewable-only fleets or emissions-free vehicles. Then, obviously, why would we have intercity coaches that still run on diesel? Because if in an inner city you can do without it, well, that would be too late for us. So we are already making plans now, developing contingency plans for the future, because we want to know how we perform with an electric system vis-a-vis diesel, because it's that that advanced knowledge that we could garner now that will help us in the future. But wouldn't that shift really the level playing field with your other coach operators or your competitors? No, obviously we have an expertise in coach technology. The specifications we submit to the manufacturers are very well developed. We tell OEMs, look, we are planning to purchase 50 buses next year. And Ms. Zieschang earlier today mentioned how many coaches and buses we have on the road. Obviously, not as many, possibly as many as passenger cars or trucks. So this is why OEMs may say coach production is a great thing, but we do trucks or passenger cars. And now here, our company comes, Flixbus, says, look, next year we want to buy 50 coaches. Doesn't sound like much in the general picture, but for an individual manufacturer that may be interesting. And because we have a shared fleet where the configuration has to be the same, we can't have 41 seats in one bus or 53 in another one, so we're standardized, we're streamlined, and therefore we can partner reasonably well with the industry and maybe team up with other operators in order to get economical conditions of sale. Or we tell OEMs, look, maybe we're expecting a good charging infrastructure next year and we're ready to purchase 20 electric coaches. Now, would that mean that the funding system you think is good enough, is adequate for operators to receive enough funding to place good orders with manufacturers? But would you rather think we need more R&D support in order to improve technologies in terms of driving ranges, critical volumes? What's the industry's take on it? What I think is we have to focus on the implementation side. We need to solve the problems and focus just on that. Again, as I said, the funding landscape is very good, especially for public transportations. With the stimulus package for 2021 after the COVID pandemic, we have seen some excellent solutions there. There's an effect that is true for our customers, coach operators, small operators that have been suffering a lot because after the shutdown or the lockdown, they cannot recoup their assets. I mean, March or April, they were expecting to start the holiday season and was truncated or stopped before it even started. And we don't see at the moment that the pendulum will swing back to normal. So it requires some very precise political prudence to provide support to those companies that are very harshly impacted by the pandemic and cannot do any more business than they want now. But that's a separate issue. But coming back to funding, the funding schemes are good, the financing opportunities, and what is important is that we now put these new technologies into practice, deliver buses and coaches to our customers to make sure people can enjoy those new technologies because they are fun to travel on. Ms. Ziesching? Yeah, just following up on that. Touring coaches is a major issue because on the 16th of March, the Federal Chancellor has for the first time consulted with the state premiers of the federal states, and at the same time also a ban on coach tours was issued. Now for us this has meant that we had to implement that across the country in all federal states, and this is why very early on we developed a number of support or liquidity enhancement programs for this industry. Because with the earlier rescue or stimulus package was to bolster the liquidity in companies, but if you buy a new coach, that costs a lot of money, and you have to finance it, pay back your loan charges and your interest. And if you don't have any income coming in, that creates a devastating situation. So therefore we launched 170 million euros of contingency cost program for bus and coach operators, and especially that money can be used for paying back loans for newly purchased coaches. I think the program now ends at the end of this month, but we've seen that many people actually have applied and have received funding out of that source. Now finally, can we come back to the title of our discussion here, the imposed austerity measures? Are we coming back to a situation where people say, well, maybe we improve our mobility offers with economical diesel engines to make people change from private cars to public transport, or are we going to continue to invest on electric buses? Will there be a time where we need to prioritize between, maybe increase the service offer, or alternatively, just invest the same money but elsewhere for electric vehicles. Well, that would mean you're just shifting funds around within one system. If we are serious about climate action, we should make adequate money sources available to cater to those needs. Now, where are the biggest challenges? Well, transportation certainly is a critical sector because it's a lever for climate action and achieving our climate targets. And if we're serious about those targets, we would want to make sure that the transportation sector turns green. So if I understand your question correctly, there are, of course, distribution battles within the transportation sector. And I think the money needs to go where you can achieve most for our climate. So probably what that would mean is shorten the intervals, make sure you have more buses, more public transport, so that people choose public rather than private transport. Well, that's a huge question, because there's something that worries me a bit, and I have no answer really, because you do a number of surveys, passenger surveys, and we still haven't quite understood what will happen, how that COVID pandemic will change customer behavior. And this is why it's fundamentally important to strengthen people's confidence in public transport, because those who have been riding their bicycle in the summer, in the winter, August, don't go to public transport but choose their private car again. We don't want that, and we don't know what flexibility of working times means. Maybe people say in 2 years' time, no, I cannot separate between job and family. I need to go back to my office rather than working from home. We can take it for granted, I think, that people will need to stay mobile. People need to move around, and that's a good thing. This is part of freedom of movement, but what that would mean in terms of the mobility behavior of people. We have a short-term indicator, but in the medium and long-term, we don't know where the journey is headed. It's a fascinating challenge for all of us. If we are climate-friendly and offer transport that can get it done, well, despite the pandemic or whatever, we preserve attractiveness of public transport for customers. Well, thank you very much. That was a closing comment, a remarkable one, I should say. Thank you very much for your participation in this discussion. Many thanks also to for your interest on behalf of the audience. Thank you very much and goodbye.